Well, the Zags are 2-0, but the real test begins on Monday when they face the Purdue Boilermakers to tip off the Maui Invitational. We're going to preview that game and the rest of the Maui field on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Prize Picks. Folks, go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege. Use that promo code LockedOnCollege, and you get a first deposit match of up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. Folks, happy Friday. I am thrilled to be joined today by Connor Hope. Connor co-hosts the Heat Check Hangout podcast and helps run business ops for Heat Check College Basketball. Fantastic website talking all things college hoops. He also helped contribute to the Almanac, which I referenced a handful of times on this podcast, an incredible resource to get ready for the college basketball season. Connor, extremely excited to get a chance to speak with you to talk about this really incredible Maui field. And I think before we even get into the Purdue of it all and everything, like I haven't covered college basketball for that long, but I don't think I've ever seen a field quite as stacked at the top. 5 teams ranked in the top 11 out of the 8 teams that are in this field. It just feels like an incredible group of teams we got going on. I was going to say in Maui, I guess technically in Hawaii for this year's event.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those interesting things because last year's Maui Invitational had that vibe going into it as well. Arizona, Arkansas, obviously Creighton and San Diego State living up to the billing coming into the season. Texas Tech and Ohio State fell off, which I think looking back on it, it doesn't seem as strong, but coming in, I mean, that field was basically Louisville at the bottom. You might have Cincinnati and then a bunch of teams that you thought were going to be contenders for their conference going forward. This year, I think it's a little bit safer to say that you have that. Obviously, Kansas and Purdue and Marquette are all favorites to win their conference. Gonzaga is not considered the favorite by the coaches, but I think in terms of the media and when you look at the AP poll and stuff like that, and after the loss that St. Mary's took to Weber State, Gonzaga is certainly the favorite to win their conference. Tennessee should be a contender, might be the favorite to win their conference. After what we saw from Kentucky, maybe not, but Tennessee again. So you've got what is that out of 8 that are favorites to win their conference? UCLA probably takes a step back from last year. Syracuse taking a step forward, and we'll see what Judah Mintz can do against this top competition. But that's a really solid 7 teams. Like none of those teams in my mind are teams that are going to be out of the NCAA tournament conversation before probably mid-February, where we might see Syracuse drop out. But I think they're all teams that should be in the conversation at this point in the season. Yeah,
a really incredible field. And you're right. Maybe we will see some drop off for some of these teams, but the amount of intrigue, the amount of appealing storylines coming into this is incredible. And one of them is this kind of rematch between Gonzaga and Purdue, 2 teams that played each other last year, a Gonzaga team that looked a lot different from this team, a roster, of course, with Drew Timme, with Julian Strother, Malachi Smith, Rasir Bolton, playing a Purdue team that pretty much looks the same. They haven't had a whole lot of roster turnover at all, bring back basically everybody. That group of freshman guards we saw last year in Lawyer and Braden Smith are back. Mason Gillis is back, of course. The most notable returnee, Zach Edey, the defending National Player of the Year candidate. And this Gonzaga team did not play very well against Purdue last year, particularly in the second half. And while I think the majority of people would look at this year's roster compared to last year's roster and think, well, Purdue's basically the same, Gonzaga got worse, and they got beat badly last year, and kind of make their assumptions on how this game is going to go from there. But that's not necessarily how I feel about the contest. I think Gonzaga might have some better ways to match up with Purdue with Ryan Nembhard coming in and certainly just a different feel to the team. I don't know that they're actually worse than last year's team. They are less experienced than last year's team, but I'm curious kind of your thoughts. We've seen Purdue. They've looked very, very good in their first few games. Nice win over Xavier. How do you feel Gonzaga matches up against this Purdue team with a much different roster than they had last year?
I think they're better equipped at the guard and center positions. They're bigger. Gonzaga's bigger this year than they were last year. Down low, their guards, the Gonzaga guards last year were fantastic, but I think when they were facing Purdue, you didn't quite see the role that Malachi Smith eventually earned come to fruition that early in the season. You've got Ryan Nembhard. You have Nolan Hickman playing off the ball. The biggest area of concern, and I think, Anton Watson playing the four. I love Kaufman-Wren. I think he's a fantastic four-man. I think Anton Watson clears him pretty significantly. I think the biggest area of concern for me is Lance Jones at the three, because we have a lot of promise for Dusty Stromer going forward in his career, but he is a freshman. Lance Jones has been there, done that. He was, one of the all-time leading scorers before he transferred to Purdue. He's a quick guard, put up over 1,000 points at Southern Illinois in his 4 years there. And he's looked good. He's not expected to be the leading scorer, but I think given the questions that Gonzaga still has at the three, Lance Jones is too quick to play a three big lineup and stop him. You can't really move Hickman or Nembhard off of Smith or Lawyer because they're players you have to key on. So you have to trust Stromer or whoever's playing the three to really match up against Lance Jones in a significant way. I think we'll see a lot of press early in this game because Purdue got pressed early in the season and they still haven't looked quite like they figured it out. They've been better than they were last year. But that's my biggest concern is Lance Jones is perfectly capable of going off for 18 to 20 points in this game if Mark Few can't figure out how to slow him down. And that has to be from Stromer or, you might even, I know he hasn't played significant minutes and he doesn't look quite ready for prime time, but given his athleticism, you might even see a Yo go in there just to soak up minutes against Jones. If Jones does do what I think he's capable of doing against this Gonzaga three rotation, which is be quick, play off the pick and roll, and really get at the basket. And this Purdue team shoots a lot better. That's a big concern. Gonzaga's always been, it seems like even this year, there's been times where their rotations have been a bit slow. Purdue watched that game where they lost to Fairleigh Dickinson and went, we're just going to shoot the ball. They're sixth in the country, shooting over 46% from three. They shot over 46% against Xavier. They're shooting about 40% of their shots are coming from beyond the arc. Like, this is a team that's really bought into shooting the ball, which makes them a little bit different than they were last year. Because last year it seemed like it was all Edey all the time. And some of those players were hesitant. And this team's not hesitant from deep this season.
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed it. I've seen so many conversations with people who are like, oh, well, Purdue doesn't shoot a lot of threes. They can't shoot very well. So Gonzaga just pack it in and make them shoot over the top. And it's like, oh, that's coming from people who the last time they watched Purdue was against Fairleigh Dickinson. If you haven't seen them this year, that's not really the way that they're playing. They are shooting a lot more threes. Those guards have taken that sophomore leap that we so often see. And I'm glad you mentioned the press too, because to me, that feels like a big area. And we saw Gonzaga play the press, experiment with it a lot against Lewis Clark State. We've seen them experiment with it early in the year. And to me, I think this is the reason why. I think the reason that they were putting the press in early this season was so that they would be ready to implement it against Purdue. And, Anton Watson is absolutely lethal in the open court defensively. And we've seen Dusty Stromer play at the very front of that press as well. And I think that to me feels like a big key in terms of what Gonzaga needs to do to beat Purdue is press and kind of push them off. Don't let them get comfortable offensively. And hopefully, I think you do want to try to force them to shoot threes because the alternative is just letting Zach Edey cook. Yeah. But this is a Purdue team that can shoot pretty well. So to me, the press feels like a big key in terms of how they can potentially beat Purdue here.
Yeah, it's press them. It's limit the damage that Edey can do. I just talked up Lance Jones for about 10 minutes. Force Lance Jones to shoot the ball.
Yeah.
Force Kaufman Wren to shoot the ball. If you can key on Smith and Lawyer, you make sure that Lance Jones can't get at the basket. I think they'll do pretty well. I mean, Gonzaga is never going to be an elite defense, and I don't think we expected that this season, but they can hang with Purdue offensively. They just need to make sure that the right players for Purdue are the ones that are taking the shots, which would mean you're kind of, I mean, we could see a big Kaufman Wren or big Lance Jones game, and I'd be perfectly comfortable with that.
Yeah.
If it means that Edey only gets 17 points and Smith and Lawyer combined for like 20 to 25, like that, then you're in that space where you're probably keeping pace with this Purdue team.
Well, Gonzaga is going to play either Tennessee or Syracuse on Tuesday of next week, depending, of course, on how that game shakes out and how Gonzaga versus Purdue shakes out. And Connor and I, we're going to discuss those matchups after I tell you about today's sponsor, Prize Picks. Folks, Prize Picks offers weekly promotions that can lead to big payouts like their Taco Tuesday deal. Every Tuesday, Prize Picks discounts select player projections up to 25% to provide you with even more value. And with Prize Picks reboot policy, your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. So for NFL games or college football top 25 matchups, if you have a player who gets injured in the first half and they do not return in the second half, that player is rebooted. Folks, this is pretty unprecedented in the daily fantasy sports space. PrizePicks is the only DFS platform that has injury insurance, and this app is just really easy to use. All you do is pick two or more players and choose more or less with whatever stat is given. So you can go on there, check out the Oklahoma City Thunder, Chet Holmgren, whatever his blocks points are, just pick over than that because he seems to keep hitting the over there. If he does, you get money in your pocket. So go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege. Use that promo code lockedoncollege for a first deposit match of up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege using promo code lockedoncollege for a first deposit match of up to $100. Prize Picks, it's daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, folks. Thank you again for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day as we get into the final show of the week. And of course, next week, we're going to continue talking Maui Invitational all week long. Going to be some fantastic basketball played for Feast Week. And Connor, we could probably spend another 20 minutes easily getting down on this Purdue and Gonzaga matchup. I think it's going to be an extremely fun one. But we also know that Gonzaga is going to play another game the next day, and they're going to play a really good team, either Tennessee or Syracuse. Tennessee top 10. Many places have them as a top 5 team the way they have played so far this season. It looks like that addition of Dalton Connect out of Northern Colorado is really going to pay some dividends for Rick Barnes' squad. And you kind of mentioned Judah Mintz earlier from Syracuse. I'm really intrigued to see how that backcourt of Mintz and Starling is going to kind of shake out with Red Autry. We've seen some good moments from them, some not so good moments from them so far. And I kind of want to get your thoughts on that matchup between those two teams in particular of Tennessee and Syracuse. Obviously, the Vols are going to be favored in that game, and they probably should be favored. Do you see an opportunity for Syracuse to steal one here, or do you think Tennessee is going to end up being the team advancing there?
I think it's probably going to be Tennessee. I'm still not entirely sold, and I know I'm way lower than consensus on Tennessee. I'm not entirely sold on their offense keeping this up. We've seen, I mean, their offense put 100 points up on Gonzaga early last year in their exhibition, and it just never looked the same. Dalton Connect is really good. What concerns me about him is the fact that last year when he was at Northern Colorado, he did most of his damage from deep. Yeah, he hasn't shot the same. He's been attacking the rim. I'm not entirely sold on his ability to attack the rim against high major competition at a consistent rate. However, this backcourt for Tennessee defensively is one of the best in the country between Vescovi and Ziegler. I mean, it's an elite defensive backcourt. Josiah Jordan James at the 4 is a pretty big matchup nightmare for most 4s. And I just, Syracuse is good. They should be in the conversation for the NCAA tournament. But look, this is a team that only beat Colgate by 4. They only beat New Hampshire and Canisius by like 11 points each. 2 teams that are sub 230 on Ken Palm. So they still have a lot to figure out in Autry's first year. If you shut down Starling or Mintz, I think this game is pretty close to done. Like, you need both of those players to go off to beat Tennessee. And I just think Tennessee's defensively has proven year in and year out that they're just too good to not at least shut down one of those two guards.
Yeah, Tennessee's strengths kind of match up perfectly with, I think, Syracuse's strengths as well. Tennessee is having such a good defensive backcourt is really, I think, going to be problematic for the Orange. Would be an incredible kind of signature win for Autry in his first season, but it's hard for me to see that happening. Not impossible by any stretch, but a little bit difficult. With Gonzaga, obviously, they're going to play one of these two teams. Certainly, Tennessee would be the more enticing game from a resume building perspective, win or loss in that one. But kind of quickly on both teams, I guess, how you see that matchup shaking out, whether they're playing Tennessee or Syracuse in that one.
I don't have an issue with Syracuse. Again, Gonzaga's strength right now, the front court's been really good, but the back court has been really consistent and efficient. And I don't fear Syracuse's backcourt defensively, just on offense. And if Gonzaga if they're just forced to keep pace with Syracuse offensively, I think they win that game. Syracuse's defense is outside the top 150 right now, and I don't see that improving before Gonzaga would potentially play them. Tennessee would be tough.
Yeah.
Anton Watson and Josiah Jordan-James is pretty close to an even match. Jordan James can pull Watson away from the basket a little bit, and you wouldn't put Ike on him. So unless you're running a lineup where Watson can play the 5 and you've got like a Ben Gregg or someone playing the 4, you're probably going to have Watson on him. I actually think that you'll see a lot of times where Watson and Dusty Stromer might switch, though, because I think Watson taking connect on a drive or something would be a lot better defensively. Dusty Stromer can kind of key on Jordan James on the perimeter and do his thing out there. So I'm not as worried defensively against Tennessee as I would be against Purdue, because I just don't see a single player that's really a mismatch on the defensive end. For me, it's just the offense. It's how do you consistently manufacture points against this Tennessee defense? We've seen it, and I think the Gonzaga's bench is better than Tennessee's bench. I think Tennessee's starting 5 might be a shade better at this point in the season than Gonzaga's starting 5, which is where I think pace comes into it.
Yeah.
If Gonzaga can make this game a game that's where they're running up and down the floor, I think they have the advantage. Tennessee has always liked to slow the game down. This year, especially, they're 339th in adjusted tempo on KenPom. Defensively, that drops down to 355. So they like to slow opposing teams down, and I think that doesn't do a lot to help Gonzaga on their offensive end, because they want to score a lot and quickly. But if they can get out in transition, if they can get defensive rebounds and get the ball out to Hickman and Nembhard and have like a Stromer or a Watson running down the floor with them, I think they'll do pretty well. It'll be a close game. If they play Tennessee, it'll probably be within 2 to 3, probably two possession game either way when you factor in free throws and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that'd be a really fun matchup. I'd be curious to see. I think the pace is definitely a key advantage for Gonzaga. If Nembhard and Hickman can get out in transition, it limits your ability to play those 3 big lineups that I don't frankly think we're going to see all that much of this year. Certainly would be tough to do in that game, but I think how the front court can score, those guys who can space the floor a little bit, like Gregg and Huff and potentially Ike, although I'm not sure he's going to be much of a floor spacer outside of hitting a couple threes against Eastern Oregon. But I think being able to pull some of those Tennessee defenders away from the rim might help as well. But at the end of the day, that Tennessee defensive backcourt is really good, and Nembhard and Hickman are going to have to have phenomenal games, and Dusty's going to have to play like somebody who's not a freshman, I think, for Gonzaga to win that one. But I agree, it would be a really close one if they played.
Yeah, I think the benefit is that Tennessee doesn't have Kamwa or Plavsic, or like they're not going to play bully ball down low.
Yeah.
And Kamwa was their best best front court player last year. That he's gone. I mean, he's looking fantastic. That whole
So
Michigan
good at
team is
Michigan.
looking fantastic. But I think offensively, that Tennessee front court is a little bit more vulnerable this year than it was last year. And you see it, right? They're giving up 45% from 2-point range, which I think last year was down at like 45. Like it was similar, but I think
they played better teams.
They played better teams.
Last thing here before we move on to talk just more broadly about some of the things we've seen from Gonzaga. I want to talk about the other side of this bracket. Again, we've focused on the top half where Gonzaga is, but the bottom half you have Kansas versus Chaminade, and then you have that Marquette versus UCLA matchup. Obviously, the two favorites coming out of the bottom there are going to be Kansas and Marquette. Is that how you expect to see it shake out? I don't think there's a lot of mystery about whether Kansas is going to advance, but certainly UCLA could give Marquette some trouble, especially with some reported health issues with Tyler Kolek and his ankle.
Yeah, I mean, I just think UCLA's looked young.
Yeah, that's
so
a good
far
way
this season. Their offense has just not clicked. And again, they're running into a team that thrives off of playing kind of this havoc defense, like this defense that just makes it really tough for this UCLA team. And Dylan Andrews, I think, becomes great. Will McClendon, I think, is a pretty solid player, but the only player on this team to me that has clearly become a star so far this season is a Dembona. And he's not, I mean, he's not a guard. So going up against this Marquette defense that likes to beat you before you even get the ball into the paint, I think is going to be really tough for this UCLA team. I think UCLA probably loses this game. They'll beat Chaminade, so they'll be in the 5th place game or whatever it is. But Marquette, Kansas, two top 5 teams, I think is going to be a fantastic matchup in the second round.
Unquestionably. Well, we're going to have more about Maui coming up next week. We'll talk about them in a preview episode again before Monday's game. We'll, of course, talk about what's going to happen after we find out how Gonzaga does. 2 p.m. for that game Pacific time on Monday. The Zags will either play at 11:30 a.m. if they lose or 5 p.m. on Tuesday if they win. So do your best to plan accordingly out there for those 2 games heading into next week. But Connor and I are going to close out the show discussing Gonzaga's team a bit more broadly. We're going to talk about the depth on the roster. We're going to talk a little bit about Gonzaga's young players, including the performance of Braden Huff, who is our game changer of the week, as brought to you by the Athletic Brewing Company. Much like how Braden Huff has changed Gonzaga so far this season, Athletic Brewing has completely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good. They are full flavor and well-crafted. After scoring 19 points in his debut against Yale, Huff dropped 23 against Eastern Oregon in just 14 minutes. Athletic Brewing has over 50 styles of craft non-alcoholic beers, including IPAs, golden sours, and more. And the brews are fit for all times. You can drink them anytime, anywhere, and make any activity more enjoyable, like watching the big games. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic brews at a store near you or buy them online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use promo code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. All right, Connor, let's talk a little bit about this Gonzaga basketball team because frankly, I've continued to use caveats. Okay, Braden Huff looked excellent in Craziness in the Kennel, but that was a team scrimmage against your own teammates. It's a little bit different. Then Braden Huff looked really good against Lewis Clark State. And it's like, well, that's an exhibition game. It's a D3 opponent. Then he looked really good in the Yale game. And then he looked really good in the Eastern Oregon game, which is granted, I said this on the podcast, Eastern Oregon didn't belong on the same basketball court as Gonzaga. Just not a even Division III, Division II caliber team, but it's very hard to ignore that every time Gonzaga plays, Braden Huff looks like, if not the best, one of the best players on the floor. And I don't expect him to be starting against Purdue. Like, I think he's still going to be in that kind of 3rd, 4th big role. But what have you thought about the performance we've seen from this young man so far this year?
Yeah, it's been great. And I think a lot of it, and this isn't meant to sound like I'm taking away from what Braden Huff is doing, but a lot of it is helped by the fact that Braden Huff at any minute, at any given point in the game, is no more than the 3rd biggest factor offensively
Yeah.
for opposing coaches to pay attention to, right? You have Nembhard and Hickman on almost 40 minutes a game. Like those two are both over Huff. I think even Watson and Ike to a point have to be keyed on more than Huff at this point in the season. And I think that changes down the road, because I do think that Huff is going to be, especially with his ability to stretch the floor and get offensive rebounds, he's going to be one of those players that you have to key on. What was interesting to me is that the number one lineup that Gonzaga's run, and they've run it over 30% of the time, is Nembhard, Hickman, Stromer, Watson, Huff. And I think that's telling, because that's not the starting lineup. You'd expect the starting lineup, and the starting lineup's about 20 to 21% of the time. You expect the starting lineup to be the most frequent lineup. No, it's that with Huff at the 5, Watson at the 4 lineup. And I think that is built better to beat this Purdue team than the lineup with Ike, because Ike, Watson, Bragg, Huff, I think defensively they all have about the same chance of stopping Zach Edey in the paint. But offensively, you put Watson out there, who isn't a 3-point shooter. He hasn't taken. Did he take one in the Eastern Oregon game?
He did make one in the Eastern game, I think. Yeah.
So he's taken and made 1 3 this season in regular play, but he's a threat from deep. Obviously, Huff is a threat from deep. Stromer, Hickman, Nembhard. You can't just stick Edey in the paint anymore. And I think that floor spacing he provides will allow Gonzaga to attack the rim against Edey a lot better than having an Ike in there, who, while he can take threes if he wants to, and while he can really, effectively get up to about 10 to 15 feet from the rim, most of his damage is done down low. And I would want, as a coach, to get and force Edey away from the basket as often as possible, in the same way that Fairleigh Dickinson did when they beat Purdue. And you're not going to defend Purdue the same way FDU did, but on the offensive end, pulling Edey away from the rim did a lot of favors for a very small FDU team. And Gonzaga's not small, but they're not Zach Edey sized.
No.
So, but I think the fact that he did it too against a 7-footer on Yale's team, he's just looked really efficient, really good. And people are going to be like, why didn't he play last year? Right. And that's always the question. I think Mark Few does a really good job of recruiting players that he knows are going to be big players 2 years out.
And
that's exactly what he did with Huff.
The development is and the development of big men has been just incredible for decades at this point, quite honestly. And so I guess my question to you then, before we want to talk a little bit about Stromer and Hickman. Before we get to that, though, with Huff, at the end of the next week, like 1 week from now, when Maui is over, do you think there will be a much bigger national conversation around Braden Huff, a slightly bigger national conversation, no bigger? Like where do you think that people will start to kind of be more aware of him after this week? Or do you think it'll start to be like, we know that he only did it against teams like Yale and Eastern Oregon?
I think Huff's going to have success in Maui.
Yeah.
The level of success, I'm not sure. I think what you're waiting for is, talk to me after the UConn game.
Yeah, fair.
Because if he can do that against the likes of Caravan, Klingon, but I think Caravan's going to take him out to the
I think so,
3-point line a little bit more. And then against San Diego State, potentially at the end of December, although with the way San Diego State's playing, I don't know if people are going to give much credence to his success against them.
True.
But I think if he continues to put together a very solid performance, and doesn't need to be 21 points per game that he's averaging now, but if he's up in the 15 to 16 points per game and 6 to 7 boards after that Connecticut game, like, I think that's when you're starting to talk about, this is almost like a Rui season, the season before it was him and Brandon Clark, where Rui was probably one of the 5 best players on Gonzaga, came off the bench. I don't see Huff starting ever, but I think him coming off the bench is the perfect recipe for a Gonzaga team that sorely needed someone to step up as a bench scorer. And I think he's done that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think Huff, why fix it? If it ain't broke, if Huff's continuing to play well off the bench, I think you roll with that. And want to talk about Dusty Stromer a little bit here too. We talked about him a bit earlier, obviously thrust into a starting role in a situation where he was expected to probably fill a different role as kind of an energy guy coming off the bench and offering more defensive instincts and kind of just a change of pace from Steel Venters. That's no longer the case. He is now in that starting lineup. Do you expect him to remain in the starting lineup throughout the season? And what are areas you kind of hope to see him kind of grow throughout this year now that he has more on his plate than he was expected to?
Yeah, I expect him to stay in the starting lineup. We have rarely seen, barring injury, Mark Few change the starting lineup. The last time I can remember it happening, or the most significant time I can remember it happening, was Andrew Nembhard earning the starting role over Anton Watson. And I think that made more sense because they needed a secondary guard to play alongside Suggs in that starting lineup. And Nembhard did a fantastic job of that throughout the course of the season. For me, Stromer,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think the only reason he didn't start at the beginning of the year was because he got eligible like 3 days before the season started.
I think Stromer's played well. I mean, the Eastern Oregon game was kind of rough, but it was also like I don't want to look at anything in that Eastern Oregon game and take anything away from it. He led the team in offensive rating in the game against Yale. Was 2 of 3 from deep, which is what you need from him. He got to the line, which is what you want from him. Turnovers are going to fix themselves a little bit. He's a freshman. Like those things, I think are just part of being a freshman on the wing or in the backcourt. Defensively, I think that's where you're really looking at him being in need of proving himself, but also I think defensively is where he can thrive. He has the length, he has the will. The reason why I would want to start him is because, first of all, it makes Gonzaga's continuation offense so much smoother when he's on the floor. I love the 3 big lineups at points, but those things can just look really clunky. Dusty Stromer makes it a lot smoother, but defensively, I wouldn't want one of those bigs playing an athletic wing. And Stromer is not necessarily athletic. We just talked about Lance Jones, but he, I think, is a lot more equipped to keep up with the likes of like a Carlos Marshall at Santa Clara or an Alex Dukas at St. Mary's, where you've got these really good guard wings who can shoot the 3 ball, attack the rim. You want someone who I think is a little bit more equipped to play a guard role, defending those players on a regular basis than an Anton Watson or a Ben Gregg or whoever's going to be playing the 3.
Last question for you, Connor, before I let you go. I want to talk about Nolan Hickman because all offseason here, we talked about the excitement, the enthusiasm about Hickman potentially getting to move back into an off-ball role. I thought he looked better in an off-ball role as a freshman playing alongside Andrew Nembhard until he kind of fell off pretty hard in the second half of that freshman year. Last year, obviously, some people wanted to pin a lot or all of Gonzaga's problems on Nolan Hickman. It certainly wasn't the case, but Hickman didn't make a lot happen at the point guard position. There were certainly some issues there with how he handled pressure, and ultimately just getting Gonzaga into their offense wasn't as smooth. And that was part of the reason that Mark Few went out and got Ryan Nembhard to fill in that point guard spot. And so far, Hickman's adjustment back to that off-ball role has looked really smooth to me, gives Gonzaga that secondary creator, somebody who can attack if Nembhard has to get rid of the ball because of pressure. Mark Few has, every one of Gonzaga's best teams has had 2 point guards, Suggs and Nembhard in 21, of course, Nigel Williams-Goss and Perk back in 2017. And it feels like this is kind of the way that Gonzaga wants to operate. And man, again, it's only been a couple games against not super premier opponents, but Hickman has looked really good in that role, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, he's looked confident in that role. He still has, 8 assists through 2 games. His assist rate has gone down from last year by virtue of being an off-ball guard. His turnover rate has plummeted from last year. Like, he is not giving the ball away. I know he shot 1 of 8 from deep against Yale, shot 6 of 10 from 2-point range, which is really good. The 1 of 8 to me screams confidence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not liking 12.5%.
Sure.
But he shot 35% last year.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm expecting a regression, but the fact that he was willing to take those shots screams confidence, because he looked hesitant at times last year.
Mm-hmm.
But I think playing alongside Nembhard, where he knows he doesn't have to be the Nembhard
Mm-hmm.
in this offense.
Right.
I think is going to be really good for him. And we're throwing away the Eastern Oregon game. He led the team in offensive rating against Eastern Oregon. So I think he's looked confident.
Mm-hmm.
He's always been a quiet player, I think, and you see that now. But I think his ability and the reason why he was the guard that stayed
Mm-hmm.
on this team was that he truly was someone who's buying into the Gonzaga, I'm going to play my role and it's going to make me better.
Yeah.
He didn't care about being the star guard. He cared about winning.
Mm-hmm.
And more so than anything else. And the fact that he was willing to stay and was excited to play with Ryan Nembhard, who, is going to be the star guard in this offense, I think speaks volumes about him and his character and his willingness to win. And so even if he's only averaging 9 points per game, 12 points per game at the end of the year, and he makes mistakes and stuff, I think he's going to contribute more to winning basketball this year. And I think Gonzaga fans just need to appreciate the fact that he was willing to give up his role as the point guard to allow the team to get better in what they do, which is play fast, play in transition, have a point guard that can drive to the hoop, but also find open shooters the way Ryan Nembhard can do. So I've really liked what I've seen from Hickman, and you've also seen the benefit because I've really liked what I've seen from Nembhard through the first 2 games. Yeah,
he looks absolutely incredible. Connor, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. I appreciate your time, your expertise, your insight into this upcoming tournament. Folks, that's going to wrap us up for today and for this week here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your weekend. We'll be back next week to talk a little bit more about this Purdue game and, of course, to wrap up the Maui Invitational as we get into Feast Week. Thanks again. Until next time, go Zags.